Welcome to the dark side of cinema. Today, we're diving into a twisted body horror film called Control Freak, directed by Shal Ngo. While critics gave it a 4.5 out of 10 on IMDb, the audience tells a different story, with a whopping 81% score on Rotten Tomatoes. That means there's something deeper, something sinister lurking beneath the surface. In this breakdown, we'll unravel its disturbing plot and the mind-warping theories hidden within. But before we descend into the madness, a quick request. If you love eerie breakdowns and sinister stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more dark explorations. Now, with that said, let's start today's video. So, in the beginning of the film, we meet a woman named Val, who is a very famous motivational speaker. Now, Val appears very confident. In fact, her self-help book is selling quite well. She has a happy family, including her husband Robbie. But Val definitely has some secret issues in her life. For example, she suffers from something like a compulsive disorder, where she keeps scratching her back repeatedly. Then, for some reason, Val often holds her breath underwater in the swimming pool, something that's connected to her childhood trauma. We'll talk more about that later in the video. Later on, we find out that Val is planning a kind of world tour, where she'll travel to different places across the country and abroad to give motivational speeches. The only problem is that to enter China, Val needs to show her birth certificate, which she doesn't have at the moment. Val thinks that some arrangement will be made for this, so she doesn't pay much attention to it. But we, as viewers, definitely notice one thing. Val's issue of scratching her head has started becoming more intense. One day, while Val is meditating, she notices some ants in the house. As she follows them, they lead her to a wall with a hole in it. Basically, the ants had made their home inside that wall. Meanwhile, Val learns from her manager, Crystal, that a birth certificate is absolutely required to organize the event in China, so no special arrangement could be made. Hearing this, Val goes to her Aunt Twy, since most of her childhood belongings are kept at her aunt's salon. From the conversation between Val and her aunt, we understand that she has grown quite distant from her family, mostly because her relationship with them isn't good. Val's mother died in an accident when she was very young, and her father was addicted to drugs, so Val is not in touch with him at all. Now, at her aunt's place, Val finds a lot of things, like her childhood photos and pictures of her parents, but she doesn't find her birth certificate. Her aunt tells her that Val's father had taken a box with him, and it's quite possible that the birth certificate was inside it. In other words, Val will now have to meet her father to get the certificate she needs. After this, Val returns home, and her head scratching continues to get worse. At the same time, through a conversation between Val and her husband Robbie, we learn that Robbie desperately wants to have a child, but Val isn't interested. She doesn't openly show this to Robbie, but secretly, she's been taking birth control pills to avoid getting pregnant. That night, Val completely loses control, and at one point she starts scratching her head with a piece of metal, which causes her to injure herself. In this situation, she immediately bandages the wound and wears a cap to hide the injury. Then she talks to a doctor over the phone, and the doctor clearly tells her that she should come in for a consultation right away because this could be a mental health issue. But instead of going to the doctor, Val decides to visit her father to retrieve her birth certificate. Now, Val's father, Song, who used to be a soldier, had now become a monk and was living at the Golden Grove Ministry. Song is happy to see Val, and she notices some bloodstains on his nose, indicating that he still hasn't given up drugs. They have a brief debate about their very different lifestyles, but during this conversation, Val's eyes land on a wall poster that shows a strange, black creature. When she asks about it, Song explains that it's a Vietnamese evil entity called Sanchi, which means hungry ghost or hungry parasite. According to legend, during major disasters, Sanchi latches onto a human host and fills them with an uncontrollable urge, a powerful, unnatural craving. As the host tries to suppress or deny that urge, they grow weaker, while the Sanchi becomes stronger. Eventually, it consumes both the body and soul of the host, leading to the host's complete destruction. After hearing all this, Val gets scared. In fact, she feels a little dizzy and starts having strange visions. She sees ants again, but manages to control herself. While Song goes to get her some water, Val quickly takes a key from his drawer. It was the key to a locker room. She assumes that all of Song's belongings must be in that locker, and she'll likely find her birth certificate there. So Val sets out for the locker location. On the way, she keeps scratching her head, and by now, the scratching has become dangerous, as the wound on her head has started bleeding. Anyway, Val reaches the locker room and finds her birth certificate. Along with it, she also picks up a photo album of her family. But then, she hears a sound coming from another locker, and when she checks it, she sees ants again. In fact, this time, we viewers can also see a strange entity appearing behind Val. Now, Val returns home, and the first thing she does is seal the hole in her wall from where the ants were coming out. Then, she checks the family photo album, and in one of the pictures she notices strange marks on her mother's hands. In the same photo, Val also sees a strange shadow behind her mother, though it's not very clear. Later at dinner, Val gets into an argument with her husband Robbie. Before going to bed, she puts mittens on her hands, hoping that this will stop her from scratching her head again while sleeping. But that night, Val has a terrifying experience. She sees ants crawling out of her mouth, and when she wakes up, she finds that the mitten has come off. This means she must have scratched her head again during the night. Disturbed by all this, Val visits her aunt and starts asking questions about her mother. She specifically wants to know what the marks on her mother's hands were. Did they start from scratching? Were they injury marks? Or were they symptoms of some other physical or mental condition? Her aunt explains that after the war, Val's mother suffered from some kind of injury. It was as if something had cursed her, and no matter how hard the aunt tried, she couldn't save her. Apart from that, she doesn't tell Val anything more. Val then returns home. The next day, Val has a shoot scheduled for a promotional video for her world tour. But during the shoot, she starts scratching her head and seeing strange visions. Clearly, she's not mentally stable. Seeing this, Robbie gets worried that Val might break down during her upcoming events. However, Manager Crystal still wants the event to go on, since they've secured a lot of sponsorship deals. By the way, let me mention that Robbie also works with Val. He's kind of her manager too. That night, when Robbie and Val get intimate, Val ends up scratching Robbie's back. It's at this point that Robbie realizes Val has a proper wound on her back. He tries to help her, but Val lashes out and says all sorts of things to him. Later that night, Robbie also discovers that Val has been secretly taking birth control pills. This deeply upsets him, and he ends up leaving the house. To stop herself from scratching, Val ties her hands to the bed before sleeping. But even then, the next morning, she finds that she has scratched her head again. Now, when Val realizes that Robbie has left the house, she gets extremely upset and starts falling back into her old bad habits like smoking cigarettes, eating junk food, and more. The irony here is that Val herself is a motivational speaker who always told people to quit such habits. In fact, many people had changed their lives after reading Val's books, but now Val herself is falling into the same unhealthy patterns she once warned others about. Now, Val starts seeing ants in whatever she eats, and out of frustration she breaks down the wall where the hole was, hoping to kill all the ants at once. Around this time, Val's father, Sang, shows up at her house. He tells Val that she's suffering from the same problem her mother had. According to him, Val is infected with ants. Hearing this, Val gets furious and asks him to leave the house. She even calls him a junkie, since it's obvious Sang is still using drugs. At that moment, Val starts feeling dizzy again, and Sang takes some money from her before leaving, presumably to buy more drugs. But before walking out, he warns Val that if she doesn't take care, she'll end up just like her mother. This deeply unsettles Val. She freaks out and rushes back to the locker, where she digs through old newspaper clippings about her mother's death. From these, Val learns that her mother was injured while drowning, which suggests she definitely died by drowning. In Val's mind, it becomes clear that her father must have drowned her mother. She begins getting disturbing visions of her mother drowning, and in a fit of emotion, she grabs a knife and storms into her father's monastery, threatening him. And now, friends, this is where we finally learn the full story of Val's parents, Sang and her mother. Actually, during the war, Sang was a soldier, and it was he who summoned the Sang-Shui entity. This creature appears during times of great tragedy, like war, famine, or any kind of disaster. In Sang's case, he had been involved in killing innocent people during the war, and as a result, the entity came to him through water. From Sang, it eventually passed on to his wife as well. Now, the arrival of this entity brings on strange, compulsive behavior in a person. For example, the weird marks seen on Val's mother's body were likely the result of obsessive scratching or self-harm caused by the entity's influence. Sang himself probably started using drugs and falling into addiction because of it. And now, Val has inherited the same curse. That's why she constantly scratches her head. The more a person gives in to their compulsions, the stronger the entity becomes. Eventually, it consumes both the body and the soul of its host. Now, in the past, what had happened was that Song, his wife, and daughter were on a whaleboat ride. Val's mother knew that Val was also infected, which is why she tried to drown little Val, but Song jumped into the water and saved Val, while in the process, he ended up drowning his wife. So, Val's mother died, and this is the reason Val is obsessed with water. Her trauma is associated with it, which is why she often holds her breath in the swimming pool. We'll dive a little deeper into this during the theory section. For now, we see that Song takes drugs again, and Val leaves. In all this chaos, Val completely forgets that today was her first show in this town. Somehow, she manages to make it just in time. Robbie is still upset with her, which keeps triggering tension. During the show, Val is composed at first, but after some time she starts scratching her head and completely loses control. She runs off stage and straight back home. Then, she rushes to her father's place, only to find him passed out from excessive alcohol consumption. At this point, Val scratches her head again, and this time, she literally tears open a hole in her skull, causing her to collapse unconscious. Now in the next scene, we see Val in the hospital, where the doctor is telling Robbie that Val literally has a hole in her skull, which has also caused some damage to her brain. Due to this damage, the right side of her body isn't functioning properly. It's a kind of paralysis, but the doctor says it will improve in a few days with rest, though Val will need to be taken care of. Let me tell you, Val was still seeing a monster around her, which clearly shows that she's still in serious trouble. In the following scenes, we see Robbie taking care of Val, and slowly she begins to recover. But even now, she keeps trying to scratch her head. At one point, when Robbie catches her doing it, Val insists that an entity is forcing her to behave this way, though, of course, Robbie doesn't believe her. So, in this situation, Val decides that once and for all, she's going to kill this entity. As per her plan, Val mixes intoxicating drugs into Robbie's food, which causes him to pass out. Then she ties Robbie to the bed and sets everything up to perform some kind of exorcism on herself. Now, it wasn't a literal exorcism, but more like a process to extract the entity. We can say a symbolic or improvised ritual of purification. Val challenges the entity in front of mirrors, and this entity starts attacking her. Val gets so disturbed by all of this that she removes her hand restraint so she can't scratch her head anymore. This entity, Sanchi, had now completely taken over Val and began whispering disturbing things to her, saying it would consume her soul and body piece by piece. It told her there was no point in fighting back, that resistance was useless. Now, Robbie, disturbed by all the chaos in the house, somehow manages to free himself. Meanwhile, Val fights back against Sanchi. She even cuts her own hand during the struggle, but Sanchi kept healing, recovering even after getting hurt. In this situation, Val somehow makes her way to the pool, and Sanchi follows her there. The entity continues taunting her, saying, "I am a part of you. Just give up." In this moment, Val drags Sanchi into the pool, and this scene mirrors the moment when Val's mother was drowning years ago. Val starts choking Sanchi underwater, and she herself begins to drown. Then, Val gets a vision of her mother. It seems as if her mother is saving her, but in reality, it's Robbie who jumps into the pool and pulls Val out. Here, we see something strange, a small, childlike figure in Val's hand. Even Robbie is shocked to see it. Suddenly, this creature, or entity, floats away into the water, symbolizing that it was Sanchi, now defeated. In fact, we even see Sanchi's black shadow dissolving in the water. It's finally over. After everything, Val gets cleaned up. Robbie is in the bathtub when Val walks in and shows him an ultrasound photo, revealing that she's pregnant with his child. This is Val's way of pleading with Robbie, asking him not to leave her. The final scene jumps forward in time. Val's child has now grown a bit. Val's severed hand has been surgically reattached. She looks healthier and life seems peaceful, until the last shot, where we see an ant or bug crawling on the child's face, and the movie ends. So, friends, this was the full story of Control Freak. Now let's dive into the theories and hidden meanings behind this disturbing yet fascinating film. We can divide the theories behind Control Freak into two major categories. The first category claims that the entity Sanchi actually existed. From this perspective, the entire movie becomes quite straightforward. Sanchi first appeared to Sang during the time of war. Then it transferred to his wife, and later, Val inherited it as a kind of spiritual or generational curse. The result? Sang's wife died, Sang spiraled into addiction and eventually perished, but Val was the one who broke the chain by confronting and defeating the entity. One striking detail is how water is repeatedly associated with Sanchi's presence. The first time Sanchi appears, it rises from a muddy water body during the war. It is ultimately destroyed, or at least expelled, in the swimming pool. Throughout the movie, we constantly see water symbolism. Val holding her breath in the pool, rainwater leaking into the house, etc. This suggests that Sanchi either lives in water, is drawn to water, or can only be cleansed through water. And then, just before it's destroyed, Sanchi takes the form of a strange, baby-like creature, symbolizing how the entity had fully grown by feeding on Val's compulsions. But when Val finally fights back, the creature weakens, shrinks, and is washed away. However, the very last scene complicates this happy ending. We see a bug or ant crawling on Val's child's face, hinting that Sanchi may not be gone after all. Throughout the film, these bugs were always closely tied to the entity. Whenever we saw it clearly, its face was swarming with insects. So, in this first theory, the entity is real, and all the horrors in the movie, compulsion, addiction, trauma, are the result of an actual supernatural force. Now friends, the second theory is perhaps the more disturbing and layered one. It suggests that the entity Sanchi never actually existed. Instead, the film is a metaphor for mental health, generational trauma, and the gradual collapse of identity. And honestly, this is what makes Control Freak a standout in the body horror genre. To understand this interpretation, we need to look at everything from the very beginning, but through a psychological lens. Starting with Val's father, Sang was a war veteran, and not just any soldier but someone who was forced to kill innocent people. That kind of trauma doesn't go away. Sang likely came back from the war with untreated PTSD and severe guilt, leading him to self-medicate with drugs. He likely spiraled into addiction, losing his grip on reality. Now, in the movie, it's said that the entity Sanchi comes during times of war or famine or chaos. But if you think about it, that's exactly when mental illnesses often emerge, when someone goes through unbearable stress, loss, or guilt. So the entity is just a symbol for the psychological torment Sang carried. Then comes Val's mother. Living with someone as broken as Sang must have traumatized Val's mother deeply. In fact, the newspaper cuttings hint at domestic abuse, so maybe Sang also became violent. This would have caused deep emotional deterioration in Val's mother. Eventually, she became so unstable that she decided to end her own life, taking Val with her. Only Sang saved Val, but by then, the emotional damage was already done. And then little Val. Here's where it gets tragic. Val witnessed all of this as a child. The addiction, the breakdown, the violence, the drowning. Even though she was old enough to remember, Val later suppressed all of it. Not healed, just buried deep. But this trauma never truly went away. It stayed dormant. In her teen years and adulthood, Val channeled all her energy into becoming successful. She became a motivational speaker, helping others while running from her own inner demons. But suppression always backfires. Trauma doesn't stay buried forever. The stress of the world tour, the pressure of being perfect, the tension with Robbie. These were the triggers. Slowly, Val began hallucinating, scratching herself, seeing bugs, losing control. And rather than accept this as mental illness, her mind created an enemy, an entity that she could blame. That's how psychosis can work. To protect itself, the brain constructs a story. In this case, the story of Sanchi. Every supernatural element has a psychological root. The ants, the crawling sensation from anxiety, paranoia, maybe even schizophrenia. The marks, self-harm, just like her mother. The pool scenes, reliving the trauma of her mother's drowning. The baby-shaped monster, a symbolic rebirth of all the suppressed trauma she never dealt with. And about the exorcism scene, when Val ties up Robbie and tries to perform an exorcism on herself, she's not fighting a real demon. She's fighting herself, and when she cuts off her hand, it shows the extreme lengths people go to when trying to regain control during a breakdown. The The pool scene represents Val finally confronting her past, accepting the trauma, and releasing the guilt. But the ending, just when we think everything is fine, we see an ant crawling on Val's child's face. This suggests that mental illness and trauma can be passed on, not genetically but emotionally, behaviorally, psychologically. If the trauma isn't properly treated and healed, it can infect the next generation, and that's the real horror. So, in this second theory, the entity never existed. The whole story is a psychological spiral, a body horror metaphor for trauma, addiction, generational pain, and the impossible pressure to always appear in control. So friends, while Val's speeches were changing lives, while her books were healing others, inside her, the generational trauma she had inherited was silently festering. Despite her outer success, Val never truly confronted her past. She just compartmentalized it, and we see the signs of this all through the film. For instance, as a child, Val almost drowned in the ocean, a traumatic moment tied to her mother's death. Even now, she holds her breath in the pool, timing herself. It seems like a fitness habit at first, but it's clearly a subconscious effort to confront her fear, a ritualized exposure therapy that never quite heals her. Then, there's her compulsive head scratching, which didn't always exist. This habit began just a few months before the movie's timeline, and that tells us something. OCD-like behaviors often emerge when someone is under severe psychological stress. So what triggered it? It could have been anything. The pressure of her career, the frustration with Robbie, who wasn't committing to her emotionally, the invitation to her mother's death anniversary, or something as small as a bacterial infection on her scalp that spiraled out of control. That's the thing about mental illness. It doesn't always need a big event. Sometimes a minor itch becomes a wound, then a compulsion, and then a full-blown identity fracture. Another powerful thread is Val's fear of motherhood. She probably didn't want to become a mother, not because she didn't love Robbie, but because she was scared of turning into her own mother. This self-doubt, rooted in unresolved trauma, kept eating at her. She feared she might repeat the cycle of abuse, neglect, or instability. And when we don't trust ourselves, our minds look for ways to sabotage us. Eventually, Val scratches so hard that she creates a hole in her own skull. But here's where the movie goes full-body horror. The doctors explain that this wasn't an overnight injury. It had been building over months. First, there was a minor infection. Then, due to constant scratching and possible bacteria, her skull became brittle and eventually gave in. And here's the genius of this metaphor. The hole in her head is a physical manifestation of her mental breakdown. That injury to her brain triggered hallucinations. The entity, the ants, the voices. These weren't supernatural. They were her mind crying out for help. And this breakdown wasn't just mental. It was chemical, neurological, and deeply emotional. She had given up many addictions in the past, smoking, candy, etc. But during her collapse, all these things came back, a sign that her grip on reality was slipping. Let's not forget the hole in the wall in her house, filled with ants. At first, she tries to patch it up, just like she applies ointment on her wound. But eventually, she gets overwhelmed and breaks the entire wall, just like she gives in and scratches until there's a literal hole in her skull. It's a perfect metaphor. The wall represents her mind. She kept it tidy on the surface, but the rot underneath kept growing. Until one day, it all broke apart. So, yes, on the outside, Val was in control, but internally, she was crumbling. That's the essence of Control Freak, a film about how suppressed trauma, fear of inheritance, and the pressure to be perfect can turn the mind into a horror show. Now, you might ask, why did Val's aunt call it a curse when talking about her mother? Well, in many cultures it's common to label mental health issues as curses or possessions. But if you notice closely, the aunt never directly mentioned any entity. She was probably talking about hereditary trauma or psychological breakdowns, just in the only language she knew. Val's father, too, never got real help. He self-medicated with drugs until he spiraled and blamed a non-existent force for all his pain. In the end, he died not because of a curse, but because of unresolved trauma and addiction. And that's the contrast the film shows. Where the father gave in, Val hid her struggles behind a smile, and eventually, she faced them. But then comes the question, what did Robbie actually see in the end? Was it really the baby-like entity in Val's arms? Or was he just shocked to see Val's severed hand? I personally believe that Robbie eventually left her. That's why, in the final scene, Val is alone with her child. But hey, it's also possible the director just chose not to show him, leaving it open-ended. Now, let's talk about that final ant on the child's face. To me, this hints that the cycle might repeat. Mental illness can be hereditary after all. But if you listen to Val's monologue at the end, she says clearly, "We'll face our problems together. We need to be strong." This isn't just a closing line. It's a declaration. Val has finally taken control of her trauma, and she's ready to help her child do the same. So yeah, the second theory also explains the film beautifully. In fact, the director made it clear. You can interpret this movie both ways. The ending is deliberately ambiguous, especially with that ant on the child's cheek. It's meant to make us ask questions, to spark discussions, to make us wonder, was it real, or was it all in her mind? And lastly, there's one more subtle commentary here, that sometimes motivational speakers who help others the most are battling the darkest demons themselves. So that, friends, was my explanation and theory for Control Freak 2025. Now, it's your turn. If you've got any other theories, drop them in the comments. And if you enjoyed the breakdown, like the video, share it with your friends. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel, because we bring you the darkest, creepiest, and most mind-bending breakdowns every week.